Elsa stood at the window of her throne room, breathing in the crisp morning air which accompanied the new day. The shadow of the mountains were shrinking, fleeing before the rising sun and leaving behind a field of golden light which sparkled across the harbor. The bright blue sky stretched from the farthest reaches of the fjord to the most distant mountains, not a single cloud dotting its canvas. Of course, there were never any clouds, not anymore. No clouds, no rain, and no snow, not even on the mountains. The rivers had run dry and the wells had stopped. There was no water to be found anywhere. The drought started near the beginning of spring, both fierce in its intensity and unusual in its timing. First, the snow of the mountains melted, disappearing over the course of many days as if it evaporated. It was Kristoff who first noticed this, pointing to the line of peaks behind the castle and commenting how the snow seemed to be receding, and he was right. Each morning Elsa would look out the window of her bedroom to see the edge of the snow had creeped further up the sides of the mountains. In the beginning it was more of a curiosity than a concern, as she was used to fluctuations in snow cover, perhaps not as dramatic, but fluctuations nonetheless. However, when the melting didn't stop and the snow disappeared, she knew something was wrong. By all accounts, if the snow melted as fast as it had, then the rivers should have overflowed their banks, flooding the valleys and turning waterfalls into sideways geysers. But none of that happened. In fact, the opposite occurred. The nearest waterfall, a magnificent stream of water which plummeted from the mountains high above the city, had dried up. Not all at once, not in one day, but it was a noticeable decline, its flow tapering until it slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether, as if someone dammed it up, but of course, no one had. Once the rivers stopped and the snow melted, there was a palpable sense of foreboding which passed through the kingdom. No one ever heard of such a thing, not even the old-timers, and no one knew what to do. The only thing they could do was pray for rain, but that was a prayer which had so far gone unanswered. It hadn't rained in Arendelle for almost 6 months, and without water the people couldn't survive, and they were looking to their queen to avert such a dire conclusion. Elsa, for her part, relied on her trading partners for deliveries of water, and what she received she stored in the cellar of the castle, rationing it amongst all the residents of Arendelle. Every morning it was the same routine. The people would come streaming to the castle to receive their daily allotment of water, standing in long lines which grew shorter every day as more and more people fled the kingdom. It was well that they left, Elsa thought, and she'd be lying if she said she hadn't thought about leaving too, but that was impossible. Many who remained in Arendelle simply had nowhere else to go, and she wouldn't abandon those who were trapped here. The people, for their part, trusted her to take care of them, to provide for them, and they believed she wouldn't fail them. She wished that were true. She tried to find a solution in the early days of the drought, and the obvious source of relief was her magic. Large wooden structures were built, devices resembling troughs designed to capture her ice and divert the melting waters into barrels. It had been a fine idea and an engineering marvel, but it didn't work. It's not that the contraptions hadn't produced water. They had. Over the course of a single night's melting, they'd collected enough water to fill over 20 barrels. But there was something wrong with the water, harvested from magical ice with properties unknown. Everyone who drank it got sick, falling so ill many became bedridden. Animals refused to taste it, turning away after a single sniff. Even the crops wilted and died after being doused with the unnatural liquid. Elsa was devastated and ashamed. What good was her magic if it couldn't help the people she loved? She heard footsteps in the hall. Alec? There was a short silence followed by heavy footsteps. Then a gaunt man appeared through the archway, removing his hat and tucking it under his arm. He wore a green uniform, as all the guards did, but his had red patches on the shoulders to indicate his position of authority as captain of the guard. He was older than most of the guards, the lines in his face betraying a youthful appearance, and his sandy blonde hair was flecked with gray. Elsa could tell he hadn't bathed recently, as dark smudges of dirt and mud speckled his cheeks and chin. This was unusual, she thought, for Alec was always well-groomed, clean, and presentable. He had high standards for the appearance of his men, and he was a sort who would never ask of someone what he wasn't willing to do himself. She knew he was depriving himself of water, and although it saddened her, it didn't surprise her. "Yes, Your Majesty?" He stood at attention, his back straight, his shoulders up, and his heels pressed together. Despite having served in the castle for many years, his insistence on routine never faltered. The kingdom may be crumbling around them, but Alec's sense of formality would never expire. "Have you taken your ration of water today?" This wasn't the reason she'd called him, but she felt compelled to ask. "Not yet, Your Majesty." That was all he offered, and though she waited for an explanation, she knew she'd have to pry it out of him. "When was the last time you took your ration?" "The day before yesterday, Your Majesty." "Alec!" This wasn't the first time they'd had such a discussion, but it was the first time she'd noticed evidence of his abstain. Something stirred inside her, like maternal instincts, as if it were her responsibility to care for his well-being. Alec was capable of caring for himself, she knew that, but when she saw him neglecting his own welfare, she felt like a mother who'd failed to provide for her own. It was a feeling that was becoming all too familiar. "You are to take a double ration of water today." "Your Majesty, the people, that is a command, not a request." Her words came out more stern than she intended, but that was just as well, she thought. "Yes, Your Majesty." Alec was stubborn, but she knew he'd obey. He always did. She turned back to the window, watching the line of people shrink as they received their portions, then left, carrying the water in whatever receptacles they had to carry it in. The allotment wasn't much, and it grew smaller every week. It wouldn't be long before there was no more left to give. "How much water do we have left?" A woman had brought a small child with her. He couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, and he was dancing around her as if it was an occasion for celebration, oblivious to the somber reason for their gathering. She envied him. "A week, perhaps," Alex said. 2 at the most." A week? Maybe 2? So far the people hadn't protested, though their situation was bleak. But what would they do on the morning they came for water and found there was none? "Do the people know?" "No. The records are kept under lock and key. Only you and I have access to them." "Good. Please keep it that way." She had no intention of deceiving them. She kept them informed, and they knew the stakes, that if they didn't find water, these bartered supplies would only last so long. But the people had enough problems to deal with. They didn't need to worry about how close they were to losing all hope. That was her burden to bear, and she'd bear it alone as long as she could, until there was no hope left. But that time hadn't yet come. "Anna and Kristoff should be returning today," she said, turning back to him. "They'll have news of the journey west." She intended that to sound hopeful, but it rung hollow in her ears. Was there any reason to believe this journey would end differently than the others? In the spring, after it became clear the rain was gone and the snow wouldn't be returning, every able-bodied man in the kingdom was asked to participate in a search for water. Elsa hadn't made it mandatory, as Alex suggested, but the response was overwhelming. The volunteers were split into groups and assigned to alternating one-week excursions with a period of time off in between, time intended for them to rest with their families and recover from the search. Much to Anna's dismay, Kristoff refused to take a break from the exhaustive explorations. He'd become the de facto leader of each expedition, heading up search party after search party as they combed the land in every direction, looking for the one resource that would save the kingdom from disaster. The first group of volunteers made a foray into the mountains to the north, checking the valleys for lakes and ponds that might have escaped the wrath of the drought. It was a vast area made up of difficult terrain, so repeated patrols were dispatched to make sure nothing was overlooked or forgotten. However, they found nothing. The same was true of the searches east and south. By the time they were ready to search west, along the fingers of the fjord, most of the men had left, fleeing Arendelle and taking their families with them. That left only a small number of people who were able to participate in the hunt, and perhaps that's why Kristoff insisted on a go with him on this last excursion. Or maybe he just missed her. Either way, she'd gone, and Elsa was left to worry about her safety, worry born from Anna's frequent cases of carelessness and intensified by her accident last spring, when she took a tumble while climbing a rock. But she knew Anna couldn't be in more capable hands. Besides, if they didn't find water, another accident would be the least of her concerns. If they didn't find water. How could she even consider such a notion? She didn't want to think what would happen if they didn't find water. As long as there remained places to look, she could afford the luxury of a little hope. "We're going to find water, Alec." She could tell he wasn't convinced by her assurance. Was she convinced by her own words? She had to be. If they didn't have hope, they didn't have anything. "We'll find water." "Of course, Your Majesty." He stood at attention a while longer, waiting for additional exposition that never came. Elsa wondered how many of her people had lost hope, as the captain of her guard seemed to have. "Will that be all, Your Majesty?" "Yes," she said, turning back to the window. "Thank you." Alec shoved his hat back on and prepared to leave, but stopped beneath the archway. He waited for a long moment with his head bowed, as if contemplating something, started to leave again, then turned around, coming back into the room. "Your Majesty." "Yes." She was watching the people outside. The line had dwindled to a few men with a couple of stragglers joining at the last moment. One of them, an old man with white hair, was hobbling as fast as his crooked legs would carry him, waving a silver cup over his head like a white flag. "There are rumors," Alex said. His tone was odd, and Elsa couldn't quite place it. She turned to look at him, trying to read his expression. "Rumors?" "Yes, people are saying the Duke of Wesselton brought water, but you refused his offer." It sounded like an accusation. Was he charging her with neglect? She fought against the stale remnants of emotion stirred within her the day before, then scolded herself. This was Alec, not the Duke of Wesselton. Alec had served as a guard to the royal family for many years, having been hired by her father when she was a little girl. He'd always been there, an integral part of the castle, as if he were an essential cog in the works that made it run, and perhaps that wasn't far from the truth. He'd never married, choosing instead to dedicate his life to the guardianship of Arendel's monarchs. During this time, he'd weathered multiple crises with his loyalty intact, including the Hans-led coup following her coronation. He never wavered in his allegiance, and she'd always been able to count on him for support. There was no malice in the question. "I'd never deprive you or any of my people from having the things they need if it's in my power to give it." "I know, Your Majesty. I'm sorry, I should have never brought it up." "You love these people as much as I do," she said, returning to the window. "You have nothing to apologize for." "Thank you, Your Majesty." The old man arrived at his destination just in time, huffing and puffing his relief. The waiting servants gave him 2 ladlefuls of water. "If you need me, I'll be in the cellar," Alex said, then left. He passed Olaf in the hall, and Olaf waved, flailing his little stick arm so wildly it seemed it might come off. "Elsa!" Olaf called out, running toward her in the waddling, skipping manner he used when he was happy, which was most of the time. In fact, Olaf was about the only smile regularly seen in Arendelle anymore. That smile was often able to melt through even the most bitter of spirits, but today the flicker of his grin failed to kindle any life in her own expression, or burn away the remnants of her frown. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Olaf." She picked at the loose snow clumping around a cluster of small sticks on his head arranged like hair. "Do you know what today is?" he asked, standing on his tiptoes. When he didn't continue, she realized he was waiting for an answer. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, tell me." "Ice skating day," he said, laughing and twirling away as if the throne room were a frozen lake and he was an ice skating ballerina. It made Elsa chuckle, and it felt good, even if it was brief. She could always count on Olaf to cheer her up, but today it wouldn't last. She went to her throne and sat down, tracing the outlines of its decorations with one finger. "I don't think we'll be having an ice skating day today." Olaf's head stopped mid-twirl, turning to look at Elsa as the rest of his body completed the graceful twist. "What? But we never miss ice skating day." "I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you, I promise." Olaf left the room, head low and feet shuffling in disappointment. She hated turning him away, saying no, but entertaining the kingdom with an ice skating day was the last thing she wanted to do. She just wanted to be alone. It had been a long time since she'd felt that way, since she felt like crawling in a hole and shutting out the world. She'd spent most of her childhood shutting out the world, locked away in her room, hating every minute of her solitude and yet wanting it at the same time. Hating and wanting, that was the curse for most of her life, and now it was back. For the first time since her coronation, she wanted the world to disappear, to go away and take its incredible weight off her shoulders. She went to the window again, wondering how far Kristoff and Anna were from home. Their plan was to follow the southern edge of the fjord, searching more inland at first and then turning closer to the shore on their way back. She strained to see as far west as possible, but the fjord was straddled by the feet of massive mountains, making it impossible to see beyond the nearest peak. She left the window, pacing back and forth as she mulled questions she didn't have answers for. How far had they gone? Had they found water? Had they encountered danger? This last question always vexed her, and she tried not to dwell on the dangers which waited for them in the uncharted wilderness, but it was hard not to worry. This was doubly true with Anna joining them. Not that she didn't trust Kristoff to keep her sister safe, but sometimes Anna wasn't one to listen to reason when it came to her own safety. She spent the rest of the day waiting, pacing, sitting on the throne, watching out the window and wandering the castle. She had lunch in the rose garden and dinner in the great hall, but all she could manage was a few bites, spending most of the time pushing the food around the plate until one of the servants took it away. Olaf returned with her to the throne room, and when she started pacing again, he joined her. He followed as they made their circular journey to nowhere, the shadows tracing low arches across the floor as the sun sank toward the fjord. Still, Anna and Kristoff hadn't returned. After the sunset, one of the servants arrived to light candles, and as the darkness outside drew deeper, Elsa's gnawing worry chewed a hole through her voice of reason, convincing her something had happened. Another accident, perhaps, a fall from a cliff face or an attack by some wild animal. Her worry was beginning to boil over when she heard footsteps coming down the hall. She leapt up from the throne, startling Olaf who stood beside her, and ran toward the archway just as Anna emerged, grinning and towing Kristoff close behind. "Elsa!" Anna called out, throwing her arms around her sister. Olaf joined in the embrace, wrapping his stick arms around their legs. When he noticed Kristoff standing at a distance, he gave him a wave. "Hi, Kristoff!" Kristoff waved back but didn't return the smile. Elsa held Anna at arm's length. Her dark blue dress was ruffled and scuffed around the knees, and her ruby-red sleeveless cloak had smudges of dirt along the edges. Elsa had a vision of her scaling rocky cliffs and dangling from ledges, and she shuddered, trying not to think about it. Anna's strawberry blonde hair was braided into pigtails, as usual, and her cheeks were flushed with color, nearly matching her hair in tone. Her turquoise eyes flickered between green and blue in the candlelight, freckles dancing across her nose as she smiled. "You're practically glowing," Elsa said. Elsa looked at Kristoff for some clue to Anna's excitement, but he was expressionless, scratching a hand through his thick blonde hair. "You found it, then?" Elsa said, a ray of hope daring to pierce her heart. "Did you find it?" "The water?" Anna said. "Well, no, not exactly. But I know we will. It's just a matter of time." "Oh," Elsa said, trying not to sound disappointed. Despite her effort to restrain her expectations, Anna's smile had brought a glimmer of hope, but now it was gone. She rubbed at her shoulders as if to ward off a chill, drawn once again into that shell of hopelessness that had built itself around her. Anna looked at Kristoff as if seeking direction, but Kristoff just shrugged and motioned for her to continue. She went to him, taking his hand. "Elsa, we have something to tell you." Elsa didn't notice how nervous Kristoff appeared as he glanced between the two girls, or how eager Anna was to have her attention. She was too busy trying to figure out what they were going to do now that their last hope for salvation had ended in yet another failure. It took a moment, but at last she realized they were waiting for her response. "What is it?" Elsa asked. "We're getting married!" Anna said, wriggling with excitement. Married? Elsa thought. That declaration was like getting splashed with cold water, and it shocked her out of her listless daze. Still, she could hardly believe it. She should have been jumping up and down with joy, but she was having trouble understanding the news. It wasn't a total shock, of course, as Kristoff had been courting her sister for over a year, but the timing was unexpected. With the recent escalation of the drought and their ominous report, she half expected them to be joking. She searched for some sign they were putting her on, but it was clear they weren't. Elsa forced herself to feel the joy that should have been there in the first place, and once released, she couldn't restrain it. "Married? Why, that's wonderful! That's so wonderful! I'm so happy for you!" She hugged Anna again, inhaling the forest aroma clinging to her hair and clothes like an exotic perfume. Then she narrowed her eyes at Kristoff, pretending to be displeased. "It's about time," she growled. She took her sister's hands, forgetting about the water and the drought and the long lines of people outside her window. For now there was only Kristoff and Anna, and she wanted to enjoy this moment with them, but the moment was broken by Anna's gasp. "You're wearing the gloves again!" Elsa buried her hands in the folds of her crossed arms. She'd forgotten about the gloves, and the sudden reminder made her feel self-conscious. They were a safety measure, a symbolic barrier between the world and her magic, an unfortunate staple of her 13 years of isolation, but they brought her a measure of comfort. Still, she wasn't proud of them. Anna put a hand on her arm, but Elsa turned away, going to her throne where she sat bunched up like a winter traveler next to a fire. "What happened?" Anna said. Elsa tried to relax, willing her muscles to release as she sat back in the throne. "It's nothing to worry about. Nothing I can't manage." That wasn't completely true, and she knew it. The truth was, she'd lost control again, even if it was only for a moment, and that was something to worry about. In fact, she'd been worrying about it since the Duke and his men sailed away, since she watched the last remnants of snow melt in her throne room, evaporating like the water in her kingdom. She wanted to tell Anna, to tell her how afraid she was, but she wasn't ready to give voice to her fears. Not yet. So she changed the subject. "I'm just glad you made it back safely. Did the trip go well?" "We traveled 2 days west," Kristoff said. His broad shoulders sagged on his muscular frame, and although he looked tired, and no doubt was, Elsa knew it was more than physical exhaustion which dragged him down. "We looked in every place I know. There's just no water." His voice was full of apology, as if he held himself responsible for the failure, but Elsa knew he'd done everything he could, and more, in helping with the search. No matter how much they looked, though, they just couldn't find water. "And you never will." "Thank you. I know you did your best." Olaf hopped over to Anna as if the mood of the room made him not want to be alone. "It'll work out," Anna said. "You'll see. We'll think of something." "I wish I shared your optimism," Elsa said. As usual, Anna was trying to find the hope in a hopeless situation. Most of the time that was exactly what Elsa needed to break through her dark mood, but this time it'd require more than positive thinking to overcome her melancholy. But overcome it she must. Anna had returned bubbling over with joy, and she had no intention of being the one to break her sister's spirit. "But enough of all that depressing talk," she said, standing and clasping her hands together. "You're getting married. I can't believe it." "I know," Anna said, running over to take her hands. "He asked me the morning after we left. I couldn't believe it. Here I thought we were just going on another boring trip through the wilderness, and the next day he proposes. I'd just woken up. My hair was a mess. I wasn't even dressed properly. And he gets down on one knee and asks if I'll marry him. I said yes, of course. Well, you know that. It's not like I could have said no. Well, I could have, but I didn't, and I just couldn't wait to get back to tell you." As Anna carried on with her excited chatter, her braids bouncing, her turquoise eyes dancing, Elsa couldn't help but get caught up in the joy of the moment. Her little sister was getting married, and she could hardly believe it. This was the most important event of Anna's life so far, and for the first time she was going to be there to share it with her. She'd missed so much during her years of isolation, had missed the moments that were so important, and now was her chance to make up for lost time. "It's going to be wonderful," Elsa said, swept up in a dreamscape of possibilities. She saw servants dressed in their finest, silver platters of food, crystal goblets of wine, and a throng of adoring subjects offering congratulations. It'd be the perfect wedding, she'd make sure of that. Anna deserved no less. "We'll need a few days to plan, but we'll throw the biggest ball for you. Of course we'll have your favorites, soup, roast, and ice cream, and we'll invite the whole kingdom. It'll be just like—" She stopped, like a babbling brook suddenly run dry, and her dream world shattered. The perfect wedding was replaced by empty cupboards, bare shelves, and supplies unfit for a market, much less a marriage ceremony. Elsa stared into Anna's eyes, chin trembling, thinking how she was going to let her sister down again. Tears welled up and she fought hard against them, clenching her jaw, trying to hold them back, but it was no use, and she burst into tears. Anna shot a look at Kristoff as she took Elsa into her arms, and he understood its meaning, grabbing Olaf by the hand and heading out of the room. Elsa was caught off guard by the fierceness of the emotion, surprised by her own tears, and after a brief cry she regained her composure. "I can't even have a party for my sister," she said, dabbing at her eyes. "It's the most important event of your life, and I can't even celebrate it for you." Anna gave her a sympathetic smile, and Elsa was struck at how much it made her look like their mother. She'd seen that smile upon their mother's face many times, the one that said she understood, and everything was going to be all right. "Oh, Elsa, there's nothing I want more than to be with you and Kristoff. As long as I have that, I have everything I need." "I'm so sorry." "For what?" "For ruining your moment. You were so happy when you got here, and I ruined everything. Don't be ridiculous. But I know there's something bothering you. What happened?" For Elsa, there were times when holding in her emotions was easy to do, an exercise which required little thought or effort. This wasn't one of those times. Since her reconciliation with Anna, she had far less reason to hold everything in, and she was thankful for that. The instinct to conceal her feelings was a strong one, but with Anna's help she'd learned to fight against it. She recalled the evening after their ordeal with Hans. They stayed up late, sitting by the fire, drinking hot glögg and catching up on years of lost time. For the first time in her life, her emotions came pouring out, and Anna was more than ready to receive them. They laughed together and cried together, and her sister gave her a comfort she'd never known. Elsa sat on the throne, and Anna knelt down, leaning on the armrest. Elsa was already feeling the relief that only her sister's presence could provide. "The Duke of Wesselton came here yesterday." "He did? What did he say?" "He brought food and water in exchange for all the best land in Arendelle." Anna gasped. "He didn't." Elsa nodded. "Did you do it?" "No, of course not." "Good. What did you do?" Elsa recalled the Duke's terrified expression as she unleashed her magically infused rebuke. "I banished him from Arendelle and had Marshmallow throw him out." Anna tried to stifle a giggle but made a strange snorting sound instead. Elsa laughed at this, which made Anna laugh, which only made them both laugh even harder. Elsa dabbed at her eyes again, happy to have her sister back, but the levity was soon replaced by dark thoughts which chased away her smile. She considered the possible consequences of her actions and the weight behind the Duke's accusation. She had tried to push his words out of her mind, to not dwell on them, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't avoid their torment. "Do you think I could be causing this drought?" "Elsa, is that what this is all about?" Now that it was out, that her concern had been spoken aloud, she found it a bit easier to continue. Having Anna there was like adding water to a flume, but with the flow of words came the flow of emotions, and she took a deep breath to hold them back. "Arendelle is the only kingdom suffering from this tragedy, suffering from this awful drought. What if my magic is causing the people of Arendelle to suffer? What if this is all my fault? Your magic is the most beautiful thing I've ever known." The words brought Elsa no comfort. She thought about freezing the fjord during her coronation and striking Anna upon the North Mountain, and she couldn't get little Anna's cold, lifeless body out of her mind, a child struck down by a wayward bolt of magic. "My magic has only ever hurt the people I love." She had a long history of being the source of so much pain and misery, she thought. She wanted to believe she'd left that all behind after the great thaw, but something told her she was wrong. She struggled against a wall of emotion. Her next words were slow in coming, and they came out as a whisper. "What if it's true? No, you can't believe that." But she did believe that. She believed because it had happened before, and she believed it could happen again. Her chest hitched as the wall of emotion grew, and she stifled a sob, holding back the tears. It took all her strength to speak the next words, but she forced herself to say them. "What if I'm killing my people?" She'd barely finished the sentence before bursting into tears, collapsing in Anna's arms. Elsa didn't notice the faint crackling sound, nor was she aware of the fuzzy sheen of ice which sprouted over her throne like crystalline moss. It raced down the armrests and over the dais and onto the floor, where it spread in every direction in a burst of white, star-like patterns. "Elsa!" Anna cried out. Elsa recoiled in horror, suddenly realizing what happened. Anna's face and shoulders were covered in frost, her hair as stiff and cold as icicles. Elsa leapt to her feet and backed away. She'd done it again, she thought. She'd put her sister in danger. Without a word, she sprinted out the door, running as fast as she could. Anna leapt up, running after her, wiping a film of ice crystals from her face. "Elsa, stop!" But she didn't stop. She ran through the great hall and up the stairs, and she kept running until she reached her room, where she threw herself inside, slamming the door behind her. She heard the thump of Anna's body upon the door, and her soft cries as she pounded on the white painted wood, begging Elsa to let her in. But she didn't. She put her back to the door and slid down until she was sitting, burying her face into her knees. She heard Anna do the same, slumping to the floor in the hallway, and they sat back to back with only a cold slab of wood to separate them. "Elsa," Anna said, her voice muffled and wet with sorrow, "it's not your fault."